Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. Today I'd like to do a video on the topic of war in Islam. And my reason for doing this video is because typically we hear in the media that that Islam is responsible for terrorism or extremism, and there's often even the case of the question as to whether Islam is a religion of peace or whether Islam is a religion of violence. And so I wanted today to take a look at what does Islam say about war? Specifically, what does the Quran say about war? What is the position of the Quran regarding war, or other words, jihad? So without further ado, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So in the Quran, war is portrayed as a way of keeping corruption from spreading on the earth. A tool, as it were, for God to establish justice when there is the existence of injustice. War, or jihad, can then be said to be a spiritual remedy for corruption and injustice. And while war should always be a last resort, there's nothing worse in the eyes of Allah more than corruption and injustice. So jihad is a term that has a double meaning. It has both an inward meaning, which refers to the inner struggle of the individual towards purifying themselves, and in so purifying themselves, attain closeness to God. So this inner struggle is referred to as jihad, but also jihad has an exterior meaning, and this is often the meaning that's typically used within the Western media, and then of course it's been referred to as holy war. It's not exactly considered holy war, but it certainly makes the point that when used in that way, what it's really referring to is when Muslims pick up arms to fight, this is called an outward struggle in defense of the religion of Islam. And so it's referred to as jihad. So war or fighting can synonymously be associated with this term in some sense, or in that sense. So war or jihad can be used in the following or under the following conditions. So jihad can be used for defense, and of course this means in response to any direct attack on the Muslim community, or it may be in defense of another community against oppression. It could also be used as a means to establish God's law, or what is referred to in Islam as the Sharia. Of course, the Sharia specifically refers to all of the laws that has been derived from the Islamic religion and has been canonized. Also, jihad can be used under the conditions where Muslims, or the Muslim state or community, is in a treaty relationship with another nation state and or community, and in the event that they may break their treaty, that can also ensue, or that can also provoke jihad. Now, it's important to note that jihad, depending on the Muslim sect to which you belong, jihad has is used differently. So, for instance, in the Sunni sect, who are the majority Muslims, versus, say, the second majority Muslim sect, the Shia sect, of which I am of, jihad is used quite differently. So in the Sunni sect, for instance, jihad can not only be used as a means of defense, but it can also be used as a means, as an offensive, in an offensive way. And basically, they are allowed to apply offensive jihad in order to enlarge its political power or to prevent attacks or aggression onto Muslims. And so for this reason, jihad, certainly from the Sunni perspective, can be used in this way. Now, the Shia community or the Shia ulamas have said that wars can only or must only be fought as a means of defense. And if there's any preemptive attack or aggressive attack or offensive attack, then that can never be done except with the permission of and the leadership of the hidden imam. So only the hidden imam can initiate an offensive jihad. And they have given the reason because of a hadith from one of the imams, one of the 12 imams, Imam Jafar Sadiq, in which he says that if a person strikes people with his sword and calls them to himself, and if there's someone among Muslims who is more knowledgeable about the will of God, then he is certainly misguided and false. And so obviously the hidden imam is the imam of the times, of who is obviously the more knowledgeable. And so this becomes this forms the basis of the rationale for why Shias do not engage in aggressive warfare. And of course, the rationale is only the hidden imam has the necessary divine grace to avoid any error of judgment in endangering the lives of people and the goals of the Islamic revelation. Okay? But rightly so, because of the development of Islam and the history of Islam, which was under the rule of Sunni authority, and because of how they have used jihad or perceived jihad, they did not have the restrictive theology as do Shias. And so they employed jihad in an aggressive way at times in order to enlarge its political power or to prevent attack on Muslim lands. And when they were extending their Islamic rule or Islamic empire to other lands, they would offer what is known as the triple alternative. Now, the triple alternative was basically that the enemy would either be offered that they either come to embrace Islam, or if they wanted to avoid any fighting with Muslims, they would then be subdued to paying a poll tax. And of course, this poll tax was called the jizya. And the people who paid this jizya or poll tax were called dhimmis, or protected peoples. Now, the jizya was a per capita annual tax paid by these protected peoples. Then, of course, the Islamic government would protect their lives and their property using this revenue, imposed, of course, on people who were known or referred to as the people of the book. So this triple alternative, for the most part, certainly within the Sunni the Sunni perspective, that this triple alternative could only be offered to the people of the book. The people of the book, of course, are Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and Sabians. Now, the Sabians are virtually non-existent today. However, the Zoroastrians do exist somewhere between, in total, of 110 to 211,000 Zoroastrians. And of course, they live predominantly in places like India, Iran, and parts of North America. What's important here to note is that certainly under Sunni authority, only these people are considered that if Muslims were to conquer their lands, or certainly if they wanted to live in Muslim lands peacefully and within Muslim society, that they would be subjected to a per capita tax, and only the able-bodied young males, I believe the age is somewhere between 20 and 50 years old, that this tax were subjected to. So for instance, women, children, the elderly, the weak, were not subjected to this tax. And of course, the tax was only applied according to their means. And also, there is no fixed amount, depending on the various periods of time in history. That amount varied depending on the need of the community and what the community of those people were able to afford. But what was certainly clear is that it was not an exorbitant amount. It was always within the means of what they were able to pay. However, for the Shia community, all this remains to be the same for the Shia community, with the exception that they say that Imam Ali al-Islam, who is the successor of the Prophet for the Shias, his word, his actions, his practices were identical and to that of the Messenger of Allah. And so we hold them on par, with the exception that Imam Ali was not a prophet, but an imam. He was the leader of the Shia community. And what he said was that not only are the people of the book allowed of being subjected to the poll tax, but also people who was of different religions. So even a community of polytheists would be allowed to exist in this type of contractual agreement or covenant, as it was referred to, in which that they would pay a tax, and in exchange, the Muslim community would refrain from fighting them and would be in fact their protector, in which they protected their lives and their property from outside oppressors or invaders. And they were not they didn't have to participate in any military expeditions of the Muslims. So conscription was something that was not allowed. And just to mention as well, before I forget here, it also it was possible that one can avoid any warfare with the Muslims also, with whom, if one was also under a treaty with the Muslims. Muslims would not were not allowed, if they entered into any treaty with any other community, regardless of their faith or otherwise, were not allowed to engage in any type of warfare, unless, of course, that treaty was violated unjustifiably. So, for instance, when we look at chapter 2, verse 177, God says in the Quran, "It is not righteousness that ye turn your faces to the east and west, but righteousness is he who believeth in Allah, and those who keep their treaty when they make one, and the patient in tribulation and adversity and times of stress. Such are they who are sincere, such are the God-fearing." So what was important always to Muslims in terms of treaty was that in order to establish themselves as true believers, sincere and God-fearing, they were bound to any treaty that they made with any community, that this must not be violated, certainly on their part, because God said that to violate that treaty is to be unrighteous. So this was another way in which any community could avoid jihad with the Muslim community. But God says as well, to continue regarding this, God says that in chapter 8:58, "But if thou fearest treachery from any group, throw back their covenant or their treaty to them, so as to be on equal terms, for Allah loveth not the treacherous." Okay, so Muslims would not be bound by any treaty that is violated on behalf of the other person or party. And so in that case, it would allow them to proceed in jihad. I want to make it very clear that Islam holds human life and human dignity very, very highly, or in high regard. And in chapter 5:32, this is best summed up in the following way. It says that we ordain for the children of Israel that if anyone slew or killed a person, unless it be for murder or speaking mischief in the land, it would be as if he killed the whole of humanity. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the whole of humanity. And what's interesting about this verse is that it essentially says that one human life is equal to all of human life. So that's a very profound thought when you think of it. It doesn't matter how rich you are. It doesn't matter how poor you are, right? It doesn't matter what you've, your status or where you're from, whether you're male or female. God says that in his eyes, your life is worth the life of, your worth in his eyes is that of all of humanity. And this is such a deep and profound thought, right? So, but it really brings home the point of how important one's life is, and how Islam certainly views a human life. And yet still, Allah says in the Quran that while death or the killing of a human life is to be avoided, it does make certain qualifications. And going back to the verse says, unless it be for murder or for spreading mischief in the land. In other words, God says that there's certain things when it comes to human life that God will not tolerate or put above it, in spite of its sanctity. And the two things that God has mentioned here is that if there is someone who thinks that their life is far more precious or weighty in their eyes than and thereby allow themselves to kill or take life, God says that that person, no, this we are permitted, human beings are then permitted to take that life, the life of that person. Of course, we know in society we refer to that as capital punishment. And the second thing, God says that in the event that that person or people are engaged in spreading mischief, and I won't speak too much about that right now, but I will continue and elaborate a bit more as we continue with that. But know that these are the two exceptions. Now, just to refer to this in other verses as well, in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 190, God says, and fight in the way of Allah those who fight against you, and do not transgress, and slay them wherever you catch them, and turn them out from where they have turned you out, for strife is worse than slaying, or worse than death. It's interesting, this word strife, because in Arabic the word used is fitna. Fitna has a few different meanings. It can mean, depending on the context, trial. It can mean temptation, and it can mean sedition. Now, of course, sedition means any conduct or speech that incites people to rebel against the authority of the state or the monarch. In other words, the ruling polity. So in the absence of an overarching government over the Meccans at the time, if we take the word sedition as the proper definition here, as to say that as the proper definition under the word fitna, then what it would mean essentially is God is saying is that certainly from a divine perspective, Allah is saying that whether the Prophet has yet established or conquered Mecca, he still sees the pagan Arabs and their fighting against him and his messenger as a sort of sedition, right? That God's authority is ultimate authority, whether it has been established on the land or not. And so God says that he hates or he dislikes this fitna, this kind of sedition, this rebelliousness, which in parts of the Quran, this word oftentimes is actually referred to as oppression, right? And it's oppression or corruption. So God is saying he does not like this type of rebelliousness against the revelation to which he has revealed, because anything that goes against his revelation is a type of corruption, and it's a type of oppression. both of the self and even within the community. And the Quran goes on very clearly to acknowledge that how to treat this type of fitna or sedition. In chapter 5, verse 33, it says that the punishment of those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive with might and main to work corruption upon the earth is that they be killed or crucified, or have their hands and feet cut off from opposite sides, or exiled from the land. That is their disgrace in this world. So, very clearly and succinctly put, that God obviously sees that any rebellion against Him establishing His religion is seen as a type of corruption, a type of aggression. And God says that that is fitna, right? But it also includes anything that not necessarily only goes against His religion, but anything that creates a sense of corruption in the earth and injustice, such as oppression, and other forms of injustices. Of course, I say this goes against God's religion, because God's religion is not intent on oppressing anyone. God's religion is not intent on violating human rights, right? And of course, you hear many times in the Quran, God says that it was not Allah who wronged them, for God is not unjust in the least towards His servants. And so it's very important, certainly from an Islamic point of view, that Islam has pointed out that never does Allah, in the way He deals with humanity, ever transgresses against them, even in the least. And on the Day of Judgment, this will be borne out even more so. And so when I say that Allah intends to, any strife against Allah's religion is actually a striving against to undermine justice, right, in the form of God's religion. And so this is known as fitna, or corruption, or oppression. And this idea is constantly being spoken against in the Quran. For instance, chapter 28, verse 77, God says, "And seek not occasions for mischief in the land, for Allah loves not those who do mischief." So mischief is a general term that obviously means any type of behavior that results in harm, oppression, injustices towards another human being. Of course, the scope of this corruption is highlighted, or certainly referred to, by the angels when they inquire as to why God would create humanity as His vicegerent upon the earth, while they, human beings, would be corrupt and commit murder. And of course, in chapter 2, verse 30, this conversation goes as following. God says, "Behold, thy Lord said to the angels, I will create a vicegerent on earth. They said, Willeth thou place therein one who will work corruption and shed blood therein, whilst we do celebrate thy praises and glorify thy holy name?" He said, "I know what you know not." So careful is the Quran to stomp out human corruption that it even cautions the Muslim community about broadcasting evil or corruption even in our speech in public life. And in chapter 4, verse 148, Allah says in the Quran, Allah loveth not that evil should be spoken of openly, except where injustice had been done. In other words, in public life or in the openness of the community, God says that it is not for Muslims to speak ill or to speak ill of someone or to speak in a manner that harms others or that creates a social situation that leads to evil or corruption or fighting and doubt and mischief, etc., which begins with how people communicate in the public sphere. And things like public defamation of people, the constant backbiting about people's affairs, hate speech, illicit speech, immoral speech, etc. And of course, today in our society, we see that, there are companies that have set up and have made their fortunes on constantly gossiping about people's lives, whether it be celebrity gossiping or whatever's happening in the fashion industry, the music industry, and creates all sorts of vendetta that people have with each other, all sorts of beefs that they have with each other playing out in the public sphere, and people are constantly talking about these things, and it only furthers the fuel and the hatred as it plays out in the public sphere. And God says that this is not something that is permissible for a righteous community like that, certainly of the Muslims and in general of the believing community. I do want to illustrate certain Quranic verses that looks at jihad both as a means for dealing with or responding to oppression and injustice, and also seeing jihad or war as a defense mechanism against oppression or religious oppression in particular. So in the case of oppression and injustice, the Quran says that to those against whom war is made, permission is given to fight because they are wronged. What is wrong with you that you do not fight in the way of Allah and of the weakened among men, women, and children? So in terms of oppression and injustice, God says that you have the right to defend yourself. Moreover, you have a duty to defend the weak among the old, right? Men, women, and children. And so this is a right of any community, especially, of course, the Muslim community. Regarding defense against religious oppression, the Quran says, will you not fight a people who violated their oaths or their treaties, plotted to expel the messenger, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, and took the aggressive by being the first to assault you. And so here the verse is very clear that the Islamic community, the nascent Islamic community that was forming at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, for some time were not allowed to fight. There was no command from Allah or His Messenger that gave them that right. But there was a time after they moved from the original city of Mecca, which a lot of the oppression was occurring there, they moved to another city called Medina. And it was when they migrated to Medina and became more established, they were then given the order or the command to fight. And so God reminded them in this verse that, will you not fight the people who violated, their treaty agreement? Of course, this was, of course, in the context when they started to grow and engaged in treaty agreements with various types of tribes there, surrounding tribes, and who were struggling for their survival. And so they were still facing all sorts of oppression. And so the verse came to remind them that when it comes to their religion, they were still being oppressed. And people, or in which they were, even on the treaties with, were not committed to holding their treaty agreements. And so God reminded them. And of course, God says that, did not Allah check one set of people by means of another, there would surely have been pulled down monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques in which the name of Allah is commemorated in abundant measure. Allah will certainly aid those who aid His cause, for verily God is full of strength, exalted in might, able to enforce His will. They are those, if we establish them in the land, establish regular prayer and give regular charity, enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. With Allah rests the end and decision of all affairs. So this verse further teases out this important point that I was making here, or that I'm trying to make here, which is that the ultimate aim of war, certainly from the Quranic perspective, is for God to use it as a means of, as God says here, to check one people by way of another, or to prevent the oppression and aggression of and the injustices of one set of people by another through war. And God says that if He did not use war in this way to check oppression or evil, God says that ultimately you would have seen on the earth communities not you would not have seen communities that thrive in a way where God's religion could have been practiced, and God's names could have been praised and remembered throughout that community. Now, of course, monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques are obviously the ultimate symbols of the communities that receive God's monotheistic religion over the past, beginning obviously, including Judaism, Christianity, and Muslim being the last religion, being the last monotheistic religion. And not only that, but they are the ultimate symbols of God, of the places where God's name is remembered and hallowed. And so God uses these symbols here in that way to remind us. But also, importantly so as well, that God is highlighting also that these are the communities of faith. And so from an Islamic perspective, God here is indicating that these communities can live together, right? Muslims do not have, certainly from this verse's perspective, any right to trample on or destroy or fight against these communities, because God has said here that these are the communities in which his name is remembered and his revelation is established. And so this is why certainly Muslims have the jizya, or the annual poll tax that allows for these communities to exist within Muslim lands without us having any desire to fight or destroy them in any way. And so, when you hear in the media that Islam is an aggressive religion, an extremist religion, it simply just doesn't borne out to be true, certainly from the quranic perspective. And lastly, God says that if we establish them in the land, establish regular prayer, give regular charity, enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. And what's interesting here is Allah is saying that in the end, the ultimate goal of war is to establish the religion of God, right? Because in doing that, it eradicates injustices. And God says that the things that are most important for any community is to have a people who establish prayer, right? A people who pray, because a people who pray are people who would never involve themselves in that which is shameful. And in fact, in the Quran, Allah says that there's certain things we shouldn't, there's certain behaviors that a Muslim should not engage in, and by token a believer shouldn't engage in, especially one who prays, because that type of behavior, and I won't mention what it is because at this point it's not pertinent to this discussion, but God says that those actions are best left aside because they undermine a person's prayer or even motivation to pray. So God says keep away from those things, right? So God says that these are the people, if he were to establish them in the land, they would establish the prayer. They would become a people who pray and keep away from shameful deeds, and enjoin what is right and keep away from that which is wrong. Something that in our community today, especially in Western lands, we don't have people who are of the practice of enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong. In fact, the opposite is the case. Certainly, you see a lot of this stuff in the media where it's constantly being portrayed that marriage is no longer sacred or even desirable. Women don't need men anymore. Men have lost their place with women. Now we're questioning what it means to be a woman. All these things have lost their place between what is good and what is bad. And so people are now confused because it all started when these behaviors started to percolate within our society. No one said anything from the get-go. No one sought to enjoin what was right and morally sound. And now we're having this, a society where all these things now are causing all sorts of confusion for our children. And so God says that that's the kind of society that he wishes to establish. And on top of that, he wishes to establish a society where charity is a focal point, because charity removes poverty, and poverty is a type of blight that we see plaguing even Western societies. There's a lot of people who are living paycheck to paycheck in this society, and they don't have all of the resources at their disposal to live a very comfortable life. And it's because that the rich is constantly getting richer, and the government refuses to tax them appropriately, and in order to provide for the less fortunate. And so God says that this is the type of society that God wishes to establish, and he uses war to prevent all the evils that threaten a society like that, a godly society. And so this is the ultimate aim of war, certainly from the Islamic perspective. I want to leave it there for now. Inshallah, I will be making part 2 of this video dealing with the topic of war. If you are interested, I will see you in part 2. Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum for now.